title. Hang on. Where is it? I think. This is number 88. And part 3, I think. All right. All right, we're going to go through a couple of sections today. We're going to finish up this one and then jump through the next few. And today's a play day, so not going to be going too long, but some good, interesting stuff here that I want to get into.
Now let's discuss the final common type of player you're likely to encounter. Those are the maniacal, loose, aggressive players. And understand that the maniacs vary in level of insanity. Some will bet literally whenever you check to them. You check to them, they're betting.
That's what you see mostly on the lower levels, especially on WSOP, the 10 and Ls. Every time you check to people, a good 90% of the time, I think, 80-90% of the time, you're going to see a bet. And that's a hilarious way to exploit somebody when you c-bet the flop and then check the turn just with the monster and then lead the river. And just, it's amazing what you get paid by, side note.
But if you apply aggression, they're going to fold immediately because they think you, or their opponents in general, play too straightforwardly. And to be fair, if your opponents always play straightforwardly and their checks indicate weakness, then you should be betting a lot, right? We already discussed this earlier. So if they think your checks indicate weakness, they're going to bet very frequently. But if you check raise them, they're going to fold, right? So against those types of players, you should typically play as if they are just a little bit too loose and a little bit too aggressive. But in terms of developing your raising range, you should be raising with more draws than the GTO strategy because they're going to fold to your raises more often, right? And you should also look to trap, just check call, with many, many more premium hands because if you raise, they're going to fold, and you don't want them to fold. That said, other types of maniacs will just be lunatics, and they're going to raise, re-raise, whatever, whenever they can. They are going to try to blast you off the pot. Against these players, you must be willing to get all in much wider than you would against a normal player. So hands like...
As a personal flaw in my game that I've realized at the smallest levels is that I will default to the overly aggressive, not loose, but maniacal style of just smashing people off hands. And it works about 70-80% of the time, but I've realized that the pots that I'm winning in those instances are far smaller because usually I'm getting folds on the turn or folds on the river after a turn call. But when it doesn't work, that 30 to 25-30% of the time, I lose the whole stack. So it kind of becomes a break-even proposition from what I've seen. So I've abandoned it at this point. It works very well in tournaments, not so much in the cash games when players aren't afraid to risk their tournament life, that kind of thing.
Like strong top pairs, even medium strength top pairs become essentially premium hands. Make sure that you do not fold their aggression. These players win because their opponents fold too often. So if you know they win because because they want you to fold too often, don't fold too often. A big mistake a lot of people make is they will check raise the maniac with top pair bad kicker and then get shoved on, and then they'll fold thinking, oh, well, they must have me beat. But no, maniacs aren't going to have you beat. They're insane. To be fair, sometimes they'll have you beat, but that's the risk you have to be willing to take. We are playing poker. We're not playing chess here where you just always win, right? So against these absolutely insane maniacs, it usually makes sense to raise / get it in with your decently strong marginal made hands like top pair marginal kicker, whereas against a normal player, that's a hand that would definitely fall in the calling range. So let's take a look at a hand. Here we have a lag, loose aggressive player, raising to 250. We have a call. I would call here on the button, multi-way. We have a hand that if it does make a good hand, we can pretty happily get our money in. Flop comes king, 8, 3, 2 spades. We could raise this immediately, but we're getting pretty good odds. I don't really want to mess that up. If I do raise to 1200 and the lag jams, I have to call it off.
And the thing about the lags is, while they are very loose and aggressive and things like that, you're still coming out of early position, which still allows them to have a lot of big cards in their range. And whereas a really good player would not call off versus a jam here, the lags tend to think everybody's full of shit. So he's raising king 10 in first and then sees you do this. The instant thing they're going to think is this guy's got a flush draw, and then it's just a matter of if they want to get the money in good versus your flush draw, which in truth isn't that great. You know what I'm saying? Because you can have flush draws with backdoor straight draws like we have here, or you can have a pair, which can, you know, easily two pair or trip up to, you know, if you have, you know, 3-4 of spades here, it's just all day long better for you getting it in versus king 10, you know. But it is one of those instances where it's good to call here, because these are the kind of boards where even if you miss the turn, the lags sometimes will bet the turn and then you can raise on the draw and really fuck them up, because they're not going to see somebody raising on a draw on the turn with only one card to come. They usually don't see that coming, and even though they're lags, even though they tend to, you know, call off wider and play more hands, you can beat the fact into their head that they are beat. So every hand to them just ends up looking like a set. And when you play in this style, it's just a good aside as to how to combat this. So personally, I call here and then see if the turn misses the flush, then we go from there. But if the turn makes the flush, we're probably just going to let him keep on betting till he gets all in, with some timing issues of like waiting a few extra seconds and whatever.
That's not a great spot to be in, right? So you see how I'm kind of thinking ahead about how this hand's likely to play out? I know I didn't classify what kind of lag this is. If they're going to fold everything to a raise, then perhaps raising makes sense. That said, I think calling in this scenario is almost always the right play. Whenever you have a good draw that you really don't want to get blown off of or be forced to put all your money in with, you should be way more inclined to call.
That's an evolution of poker that's only come out in about the last 5 years, where it used to be players back in the day, before ranges and solvers and all like that, back when Hold'em was new, people would call on the draw, try to make their hand and get paid off. Over the course of time, continuation bets became more common. People understood ranges better, things like that. So players with combo draws, or, you know, even just flush draws like this, would see the aggression as a good way to get it in, because you can create your own pot odds. Whereas if you make the right raise here, if somebody was to jam against you, you're correct to call off. Even if you know that they have top set, you can actually create that bet based on how you bet. And so that was the norm for about a good 7-8 years or so. But right around, I guess it was longer than that, because right around 2016, 2017, somewhere in there, higher level players started using solvers like Jonathan Little, and they started seeing that in those instances, because of real world practicality, you don't want to create those situations where you're correct but still lose. So for the overall health of your tournament, you know, over millions and millions of trials that you're going to have in this scenario, it became, again, better to call and not get blown off the draw. And it's funny the way that poker kind of evolves in circles based on what the current meta is in the poker world. And you have to understand that we're talking about today. This is why I always say don't study anything that's more than 4 years old, because right around the 4 or 5 year mark, there's usually shifts in the way the game plays. So like Super System today is worthless, but when it was written, it was way ahead of its time. And in 2003, when I read it, it was the Bible, to the point where I still own my first original copy of Super System and have it in a special case with all my highlights and notes, because it was such a transformative time for me. And it's just kind of a trophy of how much work I put into that book. But nowadays, if you read and memorized Super System and used all the principles, you really wouldn't progress very far at all in tournaments. Cash games, you may do okay, but I don't think you're going much further than 5-10, which is great, but it kind of caps your ability if you're not using, you know, solvers, proper ranges, and just changing the things that are, you know, fundamentally different with the game today.
I think this hand definitely falls into that category. If I had a better flush draw, then, I mean, I think calling's still fine, but like say I have ace, queen of spades. If you raise ace, queen of spades and have to get it all in, it's not a problem. But whenever you raise 6-4 of spades,
because you have the ace as outs, you have backdoor straights as outs, you have, you know, blockers like, you know, when your opponent has hands in this situation, which are very common, like king, queen, king, jack, things like that, you know, you can hit the ace and you crush them. Even when they have ace, king, you know, you can still hit running 10, jack, you can hit running queens. You know, there's not a lot of really horrific scenarios for you versus a player with top pair here. The only really bad scenario here is also when raising is that the player you're raising could have the same draw better than you, though. So they could have the ace-3 of spades, and they are never going anywhere. Not only do they have immediate showdown against you right now with the pair of threes, but they also have redraw to just make you go broke. So it's another reason why you don't want to raise these, is because you end up with reverse implied odds based on betting structures.
And get all in. Sometimes you're going to be very dominated by a better draw, and that's not really where you want to be. Turns the ace of spades, though, and the lag bets.
For me, this is about the best card in the deck. It seems like an action killer because you go, well, what can the loose aggressive player have? Well, the loose aggressive player can have literally anything, but they are coming out of an earlier position, which means we have to give them credit sometimes for more high cards, meaning an ace may have just saved them. In this scenario, for me, the player has 2350 left behind effective stack. If we just call here, you know, there's going to be 3,900 in the pot. He's going to have 2/3 of a pot-sized bet left. There's really nothing else for him to do other than jam the river. So this is one of those ones where live it would be great because you can hem and haw, you can shuffle your chips, you can stare off into the middle distance and look like you're really trying to figure it out. And I never did a lot of, you know, big hand acting, you know, playing live. I was never sitting there going, But what I would do is I would kind of stare off and just kind of sit there and think, and then wait for somebody at the table to like make a reaction, even if it wasn't them, and just go, sorry, man, I'm trying to figure something out. And then just call. And then when the river comes off, you know, a non-spade, watch the guy just jam immediately into me and snap call, beat him into the pot, and roll over the flush. And it's funny because the amount of times that I did that, seeing people saying things like, what were you thinking about? And I just go, I was thinking about what I was going to have for breakfast tomorrow. You know, just like stupid shit like that. But it's the kind of thing where even online there are tells. You can take time. You can sit there and contemplate and, you know, let the time bank run and then call, making the other player think maybe this ace worries you a bit, but you don't want to fold to one bet. So little timing things that can help you.
All right, take a second. Think about what we should do to get this player to put in more money. Well, if this player is bluffing, I don't want to raise, right? I understand that we're going to get outdrawn 15 to 20% of the time if they do have a random spade, but when they don't have a random spade, they are drawing dead to nearly dead. And when they do have a spade, they're still going to lose most of the time. And the great thing about playing against the Maniac is that whenever they fail to improve with, let's say, 10 of spades, 9 of clubs, they're going to feel very inclined to bluff the river because they are going to put me on a non-premium hand because I didn't raise.
That's the main factor, is that you have not defined your hand as anything. So these guys tend to be optimists as well. You know, the tight players tend to be pessimists because, you know, they're starting with the best hand. That's why you can get paid off very easily when you can beat aces, is because they sit there and, you know, they find a way to call, but if you make too much action, they fold. These players are kind of the same way, but they're optimists if you let them have the lead. You know, taking away the lead from somebody who's tight is much different than taking it away from somebody who's loose. Loose guys will just be like, oh, well, I play garbage, so they'll just fold. Not that I think you're ever getting the queen of spades to fold here. If the guy is ace-queen with the queen of spades, jam the money, and that's great for you all day. But that's literally one combination of cards that is good for you for him to have, because he's just going to fold everything else, and you kind of cheated yourself out of the last 24 blinds.
Them, right? A big mistake a lot of people make here is to just raise the Maniac all in because they don't want to get outdrawn. But you have to realize sometimes you can get outdrawn in exchange for inducing a huge number of bluffs. So definitely call here against the Maniac. River's a 2 of spades. Yuck. So this is not a good river. However, this player bluffs too often. Don't forget. This is a neat spot because you have to ask, like, how insane is the opponent? Some people will have a decent number of just insane bluffs here with, like, Queen Jack of Hearts, whereas other players will not. Also, you want to ask, how wide will the lag value bet? Some lags will value bet very, very wide with, like, if you just give them a 10 of spades here, they're going to rip it in, even though that's a very clear marginal made hand. Whereas other lags will check that hand. If the opponent does check the river, by the way, we're clearly just checking because our hand is very marginal now. That said, against the lag, I still just probably call it off. It's unfortunate. You don't like the spot. But when you know your opponent bluffs too much, don't fold. Opponent bluffs too much, don't fold. Wow, they actually have what I called Queen Jack of Hearts. whenever they have these types of hands, they're just going to try, right? Maniacs try to make you fold. And in this scenario, realize we're going to lose a lot. But realize we're getting pot odds, right? We need to be good, what, 20, 26, 27% of the time? Are we good 27% of the time here? I mean, actually, it's a little bit more. Call it 30% of the time. We just are. Our opponent's going to have a random spade only like half the time. Maybe 55 or 60% of the time. Which means that if they're betting all of their range here, not that they necessarily will do that, but if they are betting their entire range on the river, we're going to have the best hand 40% of the time, which in this scenario, you have to put in 2,300 to win a total of, what, 8,000 or something like that. 8,600, so clearly we're getting the right pot odds if our opponent is over bluffing. And
the thing to remember in these spots, and this you'll see me say a lot when I don't 3-bet the ace-king out of position and things like that, is that I have massively underrepresented this hand. I never raised on the draw. I never raised when I made the flush. I never did all like that. So you kind of have to go through what are the combinations like and understand that you're underrepresenting the hand to get bluffed. So just because the board runs out poorly doesn't mean that you absolutely have to give it up. Now, in all honesty, you have to think logically here. Somebody with the queen of spades, absolutely jamming. Yeah, sure, fine. Because it's going to look like bullshit. But there's only one queen of spades in the deck, and there aren't a lot of combos of queen of spades for them to have here. The fact of the matter is you never tried to take the lead away, so you're inviting them to bluff. So what reasonable spades can they have? Well, they can have the jack, the 10, I suppose the 9 in some instances, depending on how loose this player plays. Since we're removing the suited ace out because the ace is on here, if the player had something like the, Jack 10 offsuit or the ace jack with the ace or with the jack of spades, I think it's a fairly clear, or ace 10 with the 10 of spades. I think it's a pretty clear check, and then you would just check the river behind and take your loss and move on. The ace jack, I don't know if you can jam it here. I think it's kind of in the same category. It kind of depends what the other player thinks about you. That being said, the way you've played it, they're not going to think you're going to call off with a worse flush. So why wouldn't they let you now bluff? They've had the lead, pre-flop, flop, and turn. They should be checking the jack of spades here and looking to call if you jam. Yeah, sometimes you're going to have the queen of spades, but again, there's only one combination. Your opponent knows that as well. And what reasonable queens of spades are you calling here that didn't 3-bet pre-flop? King, queen offsuit with the queen of spades? Sure, I guess, but honestly, with a raise and a call pre-flop, you can 3-bet that quite a bit. You're obviously 3-betting queens. I think even the ace-queen offsuit with the queen of spades can make an argument for 3-betting, but that's the most likely hand you're going to have. And in all honesty, your opponent knows that. So, especially these lag guys, like they seem like just maniacs, but they're usually basing their betting structure and their technique on the fact that they understand ranges. They just don't have the self-discipline to adhere to them. So they play loose, but they think they know what you're doing. So they'll have a very good idea of what GTO is and try to fight against it, which can work very effectively. But if you're aware of what the opponent's doing, I think this is one of those ones where you kind of have to grimace and call it off. And if you got unlucky, you got unlucky, man. But you set this up to happen. You set it up to get bet at. And just because, and there's all these spades out here. You got to remember, there's only 13 in the deck. And of those 13, only 10 of them are higher than your 6. And of those 10, you can see 5 of them. So there's only 5 cards that beat you here. And of those 5 cards, the 9 of spades isn't likely. The 7 of spades isn't likely unless these are pairs with that spade in their hand. And those are not going to bet this river. So this is a very specific one where I think you have to call very high percentage of the time versus this kind of player and just realize that if you got beat, it was purely unlucky.
That's what most maniacs do, is they overbluff, right? Don't make the play your opponent wants you to make. Make the play they don't want you to make. Here we defend 9-8 offsuit. We check. Opponent bets. So here we have a draw that's not particularly great against the maniac who is going to fold unless they have a good hand to our raise, because they think that when we raise, we must have a good hand. I think we should definitely raise because this is a draw that is not especially strong. If our opponent's just always going to shove it in on us, then I think we should be way more inclined to call. But you see how we're thinking about this, right? Notice I've already explained how to play against two different types of loose aggressive players based on their specific tendencies. You really need to find your opponent's specific tendencies and adjust accordingly. This time we do raise, they call, and now against a lag, I'm usually just going to go ahead and triple barrel this hand. Like, I already know I'm doing it, right? Because I have a gut shot, I completely lack showdown value, and whenever you're check raising with a polarized range to begin with, or perhaps as an exploit with more bluffs than you should because you know you're going to be able to make your opponent fold too often by the river because the range is too wide, you should get after it. So, I mean, beautiful turn, double gut shot, easy bet. Now if the opponent has a 10, they're going to call the turn but probably fold to a river bet. They probably don't have a ton of ace highs. They probably fold most of their ace highs to a turn bet unless they have a 10, 6, or 3. So easy jam on the river, I think. And this time we get the fold. You're not always going to get the fold, but sometimes you get the fold. All right, min raise from Maniac, definitely call any ace in the big blind. We check, opponent bets. And this is a spot where against the Maniac, again, you want to ask, if I raise, are they going to fold a lot of the time, or are they going to call and or re-raise? If they're going to call and or re-raise, you definitely want to check raise. If they are going to fold a lot, you definitely want to call.
These are the exact scenarios where I love being up against these guys because personally, especially with the backdoor heart draw, even though it's not the best, this is the exact scenario where they're just going to bang it off, triple barrel into you. Honestly, with a hand as blatantly bad as pocket tens. Like, it's kind of shocking.
Because this is a hand that can really easily just check call down, right? If we check call the flop and we know our opponents can keep betting, check call flop, check call turn, check call river, life's easy. You would not check call.
If you go back to Poker After Dark back in 2010, you'll see that Tom Dwan was unbelievably dominant in that format. And the only people that were getting the best of him, if at all, which wasn't much, was Antonio Esfandiari and Brandon Adams, who Antonio said it out loud. He said, get a pair against this guy and hold on. Like, he said it at the table, and it didn't stop Tom at all because the smaller bluffs that he was making against Antonio that got paid off, which smaller bluffs, we're talking about $100,000, didn't work, but the bigger ones did work that made him way more fucking money because even with best professionals in the world with unlimited bankroll and all like that, this kid was such a maniac. It's very Gus Hansen-like with a little bit less showdown value where it's more Isolder really, where it just, the size of the bet, it was a great example of bet sizing, forcing the best players in the world at that time to reevaluate their hands. And because he could put on so much heat and not even think about it. And this is where his inexperience was the biggest advantage that made him the biggest winner of that season, and made him extremely famous, was because he did not know what they knew to not do what he was doing. So therefore it worked because their brains would start playing tricks on them like, fuck this little shit, you know what I'm saying? And he would just put on so much pressure that they couldn't take it. This was the defense against it, was just saying, oh, this guy's a maniac. Okay, cool. I'm going to act like it's a tough decision, but I'm check calling all three streets. I don't give a fuck what this board is. I have top pair. It's over. There are no decisions here because you can't let the board influence you. I remember seeing Brandon Adams not lift his head, and at one point an announcer said, I don't think he looked at the turn in the river. Like when he was sitting there calling, and nobody ever asked him about it, but I really would have been curious about it.
Check raise the river all in, by the way, because then a lot of the maniacs will fold out their junk, right? Because they know when people check raise the river, they probably have a good hand. So this is a spot where
most underbluff spot in poker is check raising the river.
Again, my strategy is going to depend very much on what my particular opponent's tendencies are. If I expect them to just like re-raise and get it all in super wide, I'm definitely going to raise. If I expect them to fold a lot if I check raise, I'm definitely going to call. This time I do check raise. I go small to try to keep them in the pot, try to give them good odds. And now they rip it all in. Oh boy.
See, this is the problem, I think, with check raising against these players, is because this creates a scenario where you can put on that, heart-stopping pressure right on the flop. And they can do this with draws. They can do this with king-queen with the king of hearts. They can do this with, 8-10 with any heart. You know what I'm saying? They can really just pound you here because you did not 3-bet in the blind. Your best hand typically is an ace. Now, can you have 2 pair and snap them off? Sure, but they're going to have outs against you. So I don't really like this play much, and you can see by this freeze frame here how much Jonathan likes it.
Think about this spot. What do you like now, facing the all-in on the flop? Well, I already outlined this. Whenever your opponent is applying immense aggression, you would normally fold.
Not to say that I'm looking to fold here. I just don't like it anymore because now I'm playing for... Because if we had just check called that 200 on the flop, we're probably going to be facing, like 7, maybe 600 on the turn, and then on the river, like 1,400. So now we're just playing up for a pot that's almost twice the size of what I was really looking to do. But again, you just head down, call it off.
Hold this hand. To be fair, we would normally not even check raise this hand. But if we were playing against a normal player and we found ourselves in this scenario, we should probably fold. But we should never be here against a normal player. Against a maniac, I check raise wide, essentially playing this hand as a premium hand. So when you get check raised and face an all in, don't fold your premium made hands. Got to call it off. Easy call. Easy call here. Even though we have a pretty bad blocker in our hand too.
It's an easy call, but this is after he put his head in his hands and took a deep breath. Because you have to realize where you're at.
9 of hearts is pretty bad because it blocks the obvious flush draws and the obvious straight draws, at least some of the obvious straight draws. But whatever, hand's too good. Whenever you find yourself in scenarios like this, you're often going to be in spots where...
See, just like I said, he can do... I said 10-8 with any heart. He has 10-9, even better. So he's going to have outs against you. Runners off for the flush and for the gut shot. Now, in truth, what's the real odds here? You're still about 90% of the flop, but it's still playing for so much. And this is a hard thing to do, especially deeper in tournaments. First level, something like that, where I can rebuy, no problem. Yeah, this would be a spot I'd be looking for, but I'd have to already have history on this player and know what they were like. There are a few of them out there on ACR, but not too many.
I have top pair. Top pair against a lunatic is good enough. And again, sometimes you're going to be beat here, but more often than not, they're just going to be blasting it in.
All right, I think that's pretty well summed up. Let's do the quiz. Should you be willing to get all in with a wider than normal range against maniacs? Well, I think that's easily answered. Yeah, they're maniacs. So your marginal made hands become premiums. And once your hands becomes premiums, they don't go back down. If you flopped a set against somebody, hey, thanks, Uncle Bruiser. I don't have a lot of people here yet, but this will be up on YouTube, and I will probably highlight this and put it out on TikTok and stitch it with my man over here. So anybody who rewatches this, follow Uncle Bruiser, especially on TikTok, because he's one of my favorite creators, very genuine guy, and really great stories and very amazing outlooks on life. And overall, generally a very upbeat person, and I really enjoy watching him. Big fan of his for a really long time, and we responded a little while ago back and forth to each other. And then he spotted, the new videos I just put on TikTok last week because I started using that format, and it meant a lot that he liked them and said, hey, that's really cool. But yeah, Bruiser, this is what I was talking about. This is my 4 or 5 time a week thing where I don't have a delay to play. I don't know if I explained that, but, playing poker, they can see my cards. I have to have like a 5-minute delay so people can't just go, oh, I'll watch his stream and beat him. So this is one of the few times I get to do a no delay stream. So yeah, this is what it is, and this is that training site I told you about. This is part of the premium membership, the Tournament Masterclass, but like I said, they got a lot of resources and tools that you can get to use. So I'm glad you showed up, man. It means a lot. It really makes me feel good, and I got a long day of streaming today, so that really put some pep in my step. I appreciate it. So let's see here. So we're going to mark this as complete, and we're going to jump right into the next section. This is all flop strategy. I mean, it's true, man. I've gotten many hours of watching your stuff and really enjoying it. So this section was called, this is flop strategies that we're in right now, and this section is called Exploitative Adjustments. These are all the exploit adjustments that we can make, and all these, for Bruiser and everybody else, all these episodes where I'm going through this course, they're all on YouTube. They'll all have their own unique thumbnails. And you can pick them up, I think it's episode 40-ish, or Wake Up With Me number 40, where I start on this course. And you can rewatch these hundreds of times. It takes a lot to get them down. And I've only been through this course like 1.5 times, so we're almost to the point. Well, no, we're not. We're about a third of the way to the point where I stopped the second time, but because I was just too weighed down by it. I'll be watching the stream, but I will check out the website later today. Again, thank you so much. No problem, Bruiser. Yeah, I think you'll really like it. It's a lot of fun, and it's poker is one of those games that I think for people like us who the way certain parts of our brains work, it's very soothing, and it can be very much so like somebody else working with their hands doing needlepoint or something. So I think you'll really enjoy it. Fun playing with the tools too. The tools section on here is a blast. Let's see here. So now we're talking about on the flop playing multi-way. This is when somebody raised, somebody called, we're in the pot somehow, and now there's more than one. This is some of my favorite stuff, and it's a long section. So let's strap in. I'm going to be stopping it on the way.
Everything we've discussed applies specifically to heads-up pots when it's just you against one other player. But I fully realize that sometimes you're going to be in multi-way pots. This is usually going to happen in the medium stakes and high stakes games when someone raises, someone calls on the button with a reasonably wide range, as you should, and then the big blind's going to call, getting very good pot odds closing the action. In the small stakes games, quite often you'll see someone raising and then just 6 or 7 people calling, and then you'll see a 7-way flop, right? So let's go through various concepts that apply to multi-way pots. First, this is very important, range and nut advantage generally matter less as more people see the flop, because someone is likely to have a strong hand, and if it's not you, it's probably one of your opponents. Realize that the minimum defense frequency per player is drastically reduced when you are playing multi-way, which means it's fine to fold more often. For example, let's say you're in a scenario where, in a heads-up pot, let's say your opponent bets, and minimum defense frequency is, let's say, 60%. So you're allowed to fold 40% of the time, allowed, based on minimum defense frequency. Sometimes you're supposed to overfold, sometimes you're not, depending on your position, range advantage.
The thing to bring up is minimum defense frequency. The concept that was hard for me to originally get is that my minimum defense frequency is my own personal thing. So in a heads-up pot, when I'm just defending against one person, as he said, if my minimum defense frequency based on the range of my hands and the bet that I'm facing, let's say it is 60%, that means that I can fold 40% of the time. Fine. But for every other player in the pot, you divide your minimum defense frequency by that number. So if there is you, him, and another player in the pot, well, now your minimum defense frequency, you're both facing him. So if your minimum defense frequency is 60%, because of the player behind, it is now 30%. If there's another player in the pot, now you're at 20%. If there's another player in the pot, you're at 15%. And it gets worse and worse the earlier you are. If the guy bets and you're the very next person in line, it's even worse for you because you don't know if these players behind are going to be defending or if they're going to be raising. So now you can actually shave off a few points. So personally, except for situational things where you get to take the lead away, like, you're in the, this is a very common one when you're in the blinds, you've defended, the flop isn't great really for anybody. Like, let's say it's a paired flop and there's 3 people in the pot, and it goes check, check, check. You've checked first, check, and the original raiser checks. Well, now, on the turn, betting small kind of looks like you have this huge nut advantage because you're the most likely guy, especially if it's a pair of, like, 9s or lower on the board, like 9-9-4 or, 7-7 deuce, something like that. You're the guy who's most likely to have that, so therefore you can flick a bet out there, take the lead away, and then now they're defending against you. But your minimum defense frequency is mitigated not based on your specific situation. It's based on what everybody at the table has to do. So if it's 60% for you, just look around the table and go, well, there's 2, 3, 4 of us now in the pot. I don't have to defend here much at all. Check. Or if you do have one of those good hands, it's probably a raise. So
Equity realization, etc. Anyway, let's say there are 3 other players in the pot besides the bettor. Now, that 60% minimum defense frequency gets roughly divided among the players yet to act. It's usually not exactly divided like 20-20-20. Maybe it's 15-15-30, something like that. But what it amounts to is you get to fold substantially more often in multi-way pots because the minimum defense frequency is split among everybody else in the pot who is facing that bet. In general, you want to proceed cautiously in multi-way pots unless you have a very polarized range, your premium made hands and draws, right? And you want to make sure you do not pot commit yourself where you just blast your money in with a reasonably strong pre-flop hand just because it's normally strong pre-flop and normally strong in heads-up pots. For example, overpairs, top pair, top kicker, etc. become much weaker in very multi-way pots if it's clear one or two opponents want to get their money in. Good example of this. Say you raise pocket aces, ace of spades, ace of clubs under the gun. You get 7 callers, and it comes 9-8-7. All diamonds, so you have no diamonds in your hand. This is probably just a check fold because someone is likely to have a flush or a straight or 2 pair or a set, right? And if they don't have those hands, they probably have the random ace of diamonds with a pair or ace of diamonds with a draw, so with a straight draw. So that's a spot where you're just in terrible shape. Even on 9-8-7, 2 diamonds, it's not a great spot. You should probably just check. And if you check and someone bets and someone calls, or someone bets and someone raises, you should also probably just fold if you're playing a 7-way pot out of position with your aces on that 9-8-7 board. And you have to realize that when that many people see the flop, someone's going to flop well. They just are. Unless they're playing all sorts of real...
Well, see, here's the other thing, too. I think in this scenario, players have to remember the true odds of intrinsic nature hands. So, like, hands that are calling a lot pre-flop are, suited connectors, pairs... good hands that want to improve on the board. So if you're in a pot with 4 other players and you have aces, small C-bets, I think if you're out of position, you're the first to act. Usually that's the case. You're under the gun. You got called. When it checks to you and you go ahead and make the small C-bet, even getting called is bad for you, no matter what the texture is. Unless it's like an ace on the board, even then, if somebody's calling you, you know that they're on a draw. But I see this all the time in the cash games, especially the low-limit cash games where I'm trying to rebuild, where players will make this, there'll be a raise and a bunch of calls, and it'll come back to them, and they'll make a raise that is a correct raise, meaning it should work, because it's like 17 blinds. But once one player calls, now the next guy has to call getting better than 3-1, and he knows that he's behind, so he's not committed to the pot. But then you'll see this flop go down 4 ways. There was just one of these in the latest Jedi Mind, or not the latest, but the Jedi Mind Trick number 12, the blue aces or the blue deuces episode, where I was on the button and there was a raise and a call and a call and a call, and I called, and the guy in the small blind made a big re-raise. Everybody called. And I said, well, we need to flop a deuce here. And I flopped a deuce, and the guy just jams all in. Overbet pots, just jams all in. And the reason why that was so bad is because of the simple fact that he's up against the deck. I mean, he's up against 5 players who, only 1 in 12 times is somebody going to flop a set. But now you have 4 players in the pot against you. So that means 1 in 3 times somebody's going to flop a set. You know what I'm saying? Because there's that many more chances. So when he jammed all in, you can see in the video, I go, you think he's got an overpair? What do you think? Aces? And then, of course, everybody folded. I called, and the guy rolled over aces, and I just took, the whole stack. And it's just one of those things that if you're going to play in this manner, you have to realize that when multiple opponents are in the pot, if somebody only flops a pair, top pair a third of the time, well, now if you have 5 people in the pot, well, that's a 1 in 3 chance divided by 5 people. That means guaranteed somebody's got at least that. So you have to be very wary of what you're doing and base the odds not on one player, but on how many are in there.
Really junky hands like 9-2 suited and 10-3 offsuit, right? If they're playing total garbage, they're not going to connect with the board. But usually when people see the flop, they have something reasonable, right? And on boards that are very connected, someone is likely to have improved to a premium hand that can beat your overpair. If you do decide to bet the flop with aces and you get raised, fold! Now, if you're playing 3 ways, you and 2 other opponents, it becomes much more difficult to find big folds with overpairs, but you'll see that when we're playing like 7-handed, you have to be pretty tight when it comes to getting all your money in. And when you're playing 3-handed, those spots are going to play a little bit more like heads-up scenarios because there's only one other player in the pot. You always want to ask yourself how your opponent's ranges connect with the board. Understand that people's calling ranges from various positions are going to be different, right? When you raise under the gun and under the gun +1 calls, they're going to have a very different range than when, let's say, the button calls, right? And that's going to result in you playing differently against that player. Quite often, you'll raise somewhere, and then small blind and big blind will call. Understand, small blind's range is actually pretty strong if they're competent. If they're not competent and they're calling with all sorts of junk, then they're going to have a very wide range, maybe like what people call within the big blind. So you need to make sure you are very, very clearly thinking about the ranges your opponents likely have. All right, you're definitely going to want to check more often as more people see the flop. Also, when the board's more coordinated, you want to check more often, just like in heads-up pots to some extent, right? You also want to check more often when you are in earlier position, and you're going to find that if you are against a lot of players and the board's coordinated and you're in early position, you should very often be checking 100% of your range in almost every scenario, unless the board is really uncoordinated, right? And that's just because, again, someone's likely to have something and you need to proceed cautiously.
It's one of those things, too, where I'm always reminded of the scene in Searching for Bobby Fischer where the teacher Bruce is talking about the student saying, you know, it's not good for him to go to the park and play with these guys, even though he's getting good practice, because he's getting reinforcement on bad habits. And he looks at parts of his chess game like parts of his body. He can't give them up. And that, to me, rang very true when I started becoming very competitive playing poker, is that when you decide something is good and true and a tenet of poker, it's very hard to give it up. And the first thing we all learn is pocket aces is the best hand. But there are factors. Every hand can make the nuts and every hand can be junk. So it's just important to keep that in mind and not get too attached to any hand in any scenario that doesn't seem good for you. So just a side note.
It's nice, too, whenever you check, if someone bets and someone raises, you just get to fold basically everything, because now you have essentially no money in the pot, and you're likely to be against one strong range and one probably strong range, right? So you get out of the way. Let's take a look at a chord.
I had a competent player contact me after a VOD, and I had made a video explaining why I did what I did. And I had raised, and we were on a final table, and I had kings, and it got called twice, and the flop came off Queen Jack 4, and I said at the time, I really can't explain why, but I don't even want to bet this. And I checked, and the initial caller bet, and the the second caller raised. And I just sat there and I literally did this in the video. This is worthless. And I folded the hand for free. And they got the money all in, and I was up against top set of queens and a set of fours. And it was one of those ones where I was correct, and I felt very good about being correct. And it was just one of those scenarios where I didn't get 3-bet, I didn't get whatever. It was a final table. These players were very specifically tight, and betting the flop would have served me no purpose because they're not going to call if I beat them, and if I check, I might get bluffs on the turn. All this was explained in the video. And this very competent player contacted me later telling me I was wrong. And I said it's a very specific scenario and all like that, but he still said I was wrong. And to me, this is why this player isn't world class. Because he can't see the reality for the situation. So being aware of you can be beat is a very important part of poker, and in a multi-way pot, you should be even more aware. Just a side thought that I had.
Coordinated board, or at least a few coordinated boards. For example, Queen 9-8, 2 hearts, 10-9-7, 2 hearts, 10-7-6, no suits, etc. Remember, the hand values decrease when you're against a high number of opponents and when the board is coordinated, okay? It's very, very important. Don't forget this. This is a spot where a lot of people make big mistakes. Understand that your hands will generally get downgraded. Many premium made hands and heads-up pots, like top pair, top kicker, over pairs, bottom 2 pair, etc., become marginal when playing for all the money. And
thing to remember, all these scenarios that we're talking about are 40 big blinds. That's what we're talking about. So marginal, top pair, top kicker in a heads-up pot, you're pretty much happy usually getting it in at 40 big blinds starting the hand. So you'd have 38 or something on the flop, just because you're going to be having a lot of whatchamacallit, you're going to be having a lot of, draws jam against you, a lot of weaker, top pairs, things like, king, queen, and when you have ace, king, junk like that. But in a multi-way pot, it's not awesome, just because of the fact that you're more likely you're beat.
Multi-way pots, especially very multi-way pots. So you should look to check and call with hands like overpairs and top pair, top kicker, and bottom two pair in a lot of scenarios where you'd normally just be happy to get your whole stack in. Also, many draws and marginal made hands essentially become junk. Stuff like middle pair bad kicker, bottom pair bad kicker, gut shot straight draws with no overcards. These are hands that you perhaps could normally play in a heads up pot, but as it becomes more multi-way, you're going to be betting less often, and you get to be a little bit more selective with the draws you're betting with, and your marginal made hands don't need to defend as often because the minimum defense frequency for you is much lower, which allows you to very comfortably fold out the hands that are likely to be in bad shape. So, as the preflop raiser, on coordinated boards especially, do not bet with 100% of your range. Remember, the nut advantage and the range advantage are drastically reduced. So you're going to look to check very frequently. And when you do check and one player bets and it comes back to you, sometimes you're going to be check raising with your best made hands and draws. This is kind of similar to when you raise under the gun +1 and the button calls. If you want to go back and reference those scenarios, you're going to be checking some of your best hands here because you're checking very frequently when you raise under the gun +1 and the button calls. And then you're going to be looking to check raise your best made hands that are vulnerable to being outdrawn and your draws. Now, in this scenario, you should actually be checking close to 100% of the time on these coordinated multi-way boards. And in that scenario, you actually have a lot of just absolute nut hands you can check raise. Like, say it does come queen 9-8, you may not necessarily want to check raise a hand like pocket aces, because if you check raise and get re-raise, it's just terrible. Whereas if you have a straight or a set, you can pretty happily bet and get your money in. So you're going to have more actual nut hands in these scenarios, and the board's coordinated, so every hand's likely to get outdrawn, or at least live to get outdrawn. And that's going to allow you to check raise with pretty strong hands. On the uncoordinated boards, in these scenarios, it's pretty unlikely that anyone connects especially well. So hand values are going to be more similar to heads-up pots, especially in only three-way pots. Like, let's say you raise under the gun and button call. Let's say you raise under the gun, hijack calls, and button calls. Flop comes 4-3-3. It's pretty unlikely anyone has a 3, right? So this is a spot where if you had the range advantage pre-flop, which you probably are in decent shape, raising under the gun and then calling in later positions, you can probably get away betting pretty wide on that board.
Meaning you had the overpair. Meaning, you're more likely to have, jacks plus here than they are, because, they're going to be 3-betting queens plus pretty much every time. So unless you're up against the suited, ace tray, which there aren't, there's only 2 combinations left with the club and the heart, it's not very likely you're going to be up against anything. I guess, yeah, pocket 4s is in there, but I think you're going to be able to figure that out pretty quickly. So this is one where a multi-way pot, because of the board being so static for your range and early position, meaning it helps you more than them, or it's good for you more than them because they're usually looking to improve. These are ones where you can bet, and you don't have to even bet big. You can actually bet small, because you're not only saying, yeah, I like this board and I'm betting, but you're also saying, fuck both of you, I like this board and I'm betting. And both players understand that when you bet into a multi-way pot, you have to be stronger. You absolutely have to be. You can't just, because it is more likely that you're, up against something,
Same thing like king 7-3, queen 7-3, even ace XX. I think you can get away with betting pretty frequently because you have all the best hands and your opponents don't, right? However, if you raise under the gun, button calls, and big blind calls, and it comes 4-3-3, you have to be a little bit more cautious. This is kind of like the Jack 6-6 board where you raise under the gun +1 and the big blind calls. Again, go back and reference that if you don't remember it. But that's a spot where even though you have a big range advantage, you completely lack the nut advantage. And when you completely lack the nut advantage, you have to check. And in multi-way pots, you have to check even more. So be aware that you're going to be doing a lot of checking based on the ranges your opponent's likely get to the flop with, right? So you see, if the 2 players in position call, you can bet the flop 4-3-3 pretty often. But if the big blind is in there, you have to be way more cautious because 4-3-3 connects at least better for the big blind than it does under gun +1. That said, king 7-3, king 7-2, ace 7-2, boards like that, you can still probably get away betting pretty frequently. That said, if you want to check your marginal made hands like pocket kings, low ace x, I think that's perfectly fine and very viable. So you can still get away with betting frequently in these scenarios in three-handed pots, but as it becomes four-handed, five-handed, seven-handed, etc., you do have to be a little bit more cautious, and that's just because someone is likely to have something, right? Remember, when lots of people see the flop, someone's likely to have something. As the pre-flop caller, you're going to look to bet large with most of your premium hands and draws. Again, we are just betting with a polarized range. When you're playing multi-way, which implies you should be betting somewhat infrequently, you're usually going to be betting with your premium made hands and your draws. And you're going to
And with a less of a frequency of a bet, meaning you're not going to bet as often, you're going to bet more. So that should tell you the kind of hands that you're going to be playing. You're going to be betting more. So, you know, your sets, your top pairs, top kickers, your best, you know, open and straight draws with flush draws, you know, things like that.
look to check call, or perhaps check raise, with your downgraded premium hands, like overpairs and strong top pair type hands. Whenever you are in marginal shape against your opponent's betting range, which should be polarized, you should typically do a lot of calling. We saw this in the heads-up post, right? When your opponent's betting polarized, you in turn don't get to raise all that often, and you have to call way more often, and that's the case in heads-up pots as well. Let's take a look at a few hands that I played in a $5,000 tournament recently.
For clarity, $5,000 buy-in. I play $5,000 guarantees where the buy-in is $10.
This is just a random selection of hands I had tagged as multi-way, so let's take a look at a few hands. Here we have Darren Elias, good, loose, aggressive player, opens under the gun. Two big blinds, we're playing very deep stack.
WPT champion Darren Elias.
With Jack 10 of spades, you could conceivably 3-bet this because you could call a 4-bet this deep stack, but calling's fine. See the flop. See a three-way flop.
And this is super early, and it's gone well for Jonathan. He's been stealing a lot of pots. You know, having 250 blinds, you're going to be looking to flop a lot of hands, especially, you know, the juicy ones like the Jack 10s of spades and stuff like that. So, perfectly reasonable.
They check to me, and this is a scenario where I think if, like, big blind folded and button called instead, I would probably go ahead and bluff this. I don't think it's mandatory to bluff it, but...
Because the blinds are helped more by this range because they're in there with the widest range. Like you said, if big blind folds and the button had called, you know, they have something, connectivity, you know, high cards, something like that, that this board just does not help. But, you know, the blinds are in here. They can have 9-6, they can have 3-6, they can have ace-9, they can have king-9, they can have 10-9. You know, they can have all these hands just have you absolutely, you know, nutted unless you improve. They can even have hands that can really screw you over where... like, you know, 7-8, where, you know, you bet the flop and they call and they spike an 8, and now you're on the draw and you bet again, and they have the open-ender and showdown value against you. And that's just a scenario that is just absolutely miserable for you because you're not getting them off of the pot, and they actually are holding your outs. They're actually holding a 7, which decreases the odds of your outs. And hitting a 10 doesn't do you any good either because of them having the 7. They make the straight. So... you know, this is not the spot to bluff. You're kind of waiting for a very clear reason to bluff here, and that would probably be checking all the way down.
2 overcards, backdoor flush draw, backdoor straight draw is pretty decent. Here, though, I think you have to be a little bit more selective when the big blind calls, because big blind is going to have a lot of random low cards. That said, maybe I should just bet this and look to triple barrel it if the big blind calls, because big blind is going to have a lot of stuff like 9-8 and 7-6 is going to get a lot worse by the river, so... right here, I think you can go either way between... There
are scenarios where I like 3-betting here, or triple barreling here, but more commonly in tournaments, I will do a bet, check, bet, where I bet the flop, and if it checks to me on the turn, we check again, and if it checks to me on the river, then I can bet again and be very, very confident in the fact that nobody has anything great, and you actually play... you have to risk less to play to win the same pot. You don't win as big a pot, but, you know, if you go bet, 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 that third bet, you're kind of flying blind with this scenario unless you've improved. So sometimes that's a good thing to do. And if we're talking about, you know, having 250 blinds, it's a different story than, you know, the normal 40 big blind example.
Between checking and betting. If I had 8-7, I would definitely bet. If I had 10-8 suited, I would definitely bet. If I had 10-7 suited, which I don't, I would bet. If I had 4-3 suited, which I'll have, I'm sorry, 5-4 suited, which I'll have every once in a while, I would definitely bet. But you see, I really don't have a ton of bets here. Really just the suited gut shots and open-ended straight draws. and there's not a ton of combinations of those. And since there's not a ton of combinations of those, I probably want to bet a few more hands, and it seems like 2 overcards, backdoor flush draw, backdoor straight draw is a pretty good one. But you can be cautious here. You can do whatever you want. I think it's viable either way. Turns the 3 of spades. We'll definitely bet now. Check, check. And now we should certainly put out a bet. We have no showdown value. We have a flush draw, and we have 2 overcards. So this is a pretty good hand. I think you want to bet pretty big in this scenario. Remember, we're betting polarized, right? When we're betting polarized, we're going to want to bet big. In this scenario, I'm usually just betting with random 3s. Not that I have very many, but I bet some 3s. I would also bet with 9s if I did not bet them on the flop, and I would bet with overpairs if I did not bet them on the flop. Although I'd probably bet overpairs on the flop if I had them. You don't want to be betting here with a hand like a 6 or pocket 8s, I don't think. Because if you bet with those hands and get called or raised, you're usually in pretty marginal shape. So here I really am just betting a very polarized range. One thing worth noting here, though, this is not a great example of this concept on this board in particular, but if you have a pretty strong marginal made hand, like let's say I had 9-8, right? And my opponent's checked me on the turn, this is definitely a spot where I need to bet. Even though sometimes when I bet and get called, I'm going to be behind against better 9s and overpairs. This is a spot where I really want protection. Whatever my opponents have has plenty of equity, right? Because there's going to be a lot of random overcards. And when I bet, they're going to fold, but if I check, they're going to realize their equity decently well, and the river's going to be a bad card very often for a hand like 9-8. So you're going to want to bet for protection when they check to you multiple times, but you do need to be cautious if you don't really have any information about your opponent's range yet. Same thing, like if I was in the big blind here with 9-8, I would definitely bet this turn. Because, same thing, everybody at deck has overcards, and they have to be pretty unlikely to raise against the big blind, because the big blind can have a lot of 3s, right? Anyway, here we bet. Darren Elias calls. River's a 2, and he checks. We're going to discuss river strategy later, but this is a...
I think this is a bet. I mean, I think this is a scenario where he doesn't have much, but he can have us beat, where he has, like, the suited ace, queen of spades. You know what I'm saying? Or something like that, where he picked up a draw with 2 overs on the turn, but our draw with 2 overs is worse. So since we didn't improve, I think we need to bet here, and I think it needs to be fairly reasonably polarized, like 18 blinds, which would be somewhere around 3,600. We just don't want to get called by ace high. I think this is one where you have to.
Pretty mandatory bluff. In this scenario, we are going to want to bet pretty big. We are representing a very polarized range. We have to be careful against like good, strong, world-class players like Darren Elias. He's a very, very good player. A little bit call-happy. But whenever you have one of the best bluffs in your range, you just need to bluff it. When I say one of the best bluffs, I mean a bluff that completely lacks showdown value. And your opponent could easily have hands like ace high, under pairs, etc. Because if you think about his range, you raise under.
It's funny because the best bluffing candidates are the ones that have no showdown value. And it's kind of a philosophical thing where if you can win pots with the hands that can't win them on their own, you are giving these hands value. You are then making these hands worth something, whereas looking at this board, they're actually worthless. There is no scenario in this scenario where somebody raises under the gun and you can check down here and win. Because under the gun, even at this many blinds, you're not getting, people opening with things that have no showdown here. You know what I'm saying? Like, what's the one hand that calls you that has no showdown? 7-8? Who the fuck is raising that out of first? Even this early in a tournament, nobody's doing that. And if they are going to bet this flop. They are going to barrel this turn. They're not going to check it. It's not that kind of party, man. So this is why your best bluff candidates are the hands with the least showdown value. Every time you win a pot that you wouldn't have won otherwise, just due to your own actions by betting, those are major victories, and that's how you win poker tournaments.
The gun, check the flop, so he probably doesn't have... He's probably somewhat capped, right? Meaning he doesn't have a 9 or better. Or if he does have a 9, it's going to be like 10-9 suited. So he probably has something like 10-9 suited, Jack-9 suited, something like that, or worse. So you have to ask, how much will Jack-9 suited or worse call? Some players, if they're calling stations, will call literally any bet. That said, against very strong players, I am always going to be making bluffs in this spot. And I think a medium bet size of like 3,000 in this scenario would be pretty nice. And that's going to get the fold most of the time. Of course, if your opponent just like hero calls you with ace high or king, queen of spades or something absurd, then maybe you shouldn't bluff that player at all. All right, let's take a look at another hand. Here we have 800 chip raise. Old guy calls.
Huge mistake I see players make. This is the deuces hand, you know, that I was talking about. Huge mistake I see players make is 3-betting here. You're not doing shit. You'd have to make this bet so massive that if you got action on it, you can be 100% sure you're behind. This is, even though it's pocket tens, this is flop a set or fucking throw it away.
Button calls. Pocket tens, I think, can call or 3-bet here. I do a lot of calling in the small blind because if we do 3-bet here and get 4-bet, we probably have to fold, and I really don't want to fold this hand. And you know, under the gun +1 should be 4-betting some portion of the time. Also, if I 3-bet and get called, let's say I make it about 4,500 or 5,000 here, 3 times the last bet, 2,400 plus 16, 17, 18, 19. So that's 43 plus a little bit more because I'm out of position. So call it 5,000. So if I make it 5,000 here and get called, we're still out of position and not a particularly great spot where the flop's not going to be great for me. So we have to be cautious in this spot, I think. And I typically call, but if you told me you wanted to 3-bet this, I would have no problem with that.
I kind of agree because generally my default is to 3-bet or fold in the small blind. But this is so juicy. I mean, this is just so one of those spots where if you flop a 10, man, like you are going to just get doubled a lot if you get action. Because there's going to be hands on straight draws. There's going to be hands that have top pair like ace, 10, 4. You know what I'm saying? And against the very rare instance where somebody has aces, too bad. But, you know, even flopping things like 10, 7, 6 or 10, 7 deuce, it's so beautiful because the players behind you who are calling, they also have pairs. So you can set over set somebody, and because tens has so much immediate showdown value, you can actually win pots when it comes off like jack, 4, 3 or something like that. You know what I'm saying? And nobody shows interest. You can bet the turn on like a blank turn and legitimately have the best hand. So I think this is kind of like the raising on the draw on the flop a lot of times where you're going to kill your own action and put yourself in a bad spot. So I personally would default to the call here, although at the moment I think I would take a second because I do love 3-betting from the small blind. On the button, I'm well more prone to 3-betting. But from the small, I think this is just too juicy. I think you just have to call.
Whenever you do call here, though, by the way, you are going to have to learn to play well after the flop. And that often means checking and folding. Let's say the flop comes with any overcard. Make the board jack 4-2. Super dry board.
That's what I said.
On that board, if I check and someone bets, I am folding. This is a beautiful example of the spot where we're out of position, we're against a lot of people, and if I am ahead on the flop, very often the opponent will keep betting on the turn and make me fold by the river, right? And I could just be in terrible shape already. Also, whenever someone bets, the minimum defense frequency is divided among 4 other people. So, you know, let's say they bet half pot, right? So minimum defense frequency is 0.5 divided by 1.5. So we need to stick around 33% of the time, right? I'm sorry, we need to stick around 67% of the time divided by 4 people. So that's
15, 17%.
18% of the time. Is pocket tens in the top 18% of my range? It's close, but
Yeah.
I'm out of position. I'm in the worst spot here. So I actually probably need to defend a little bit less than everybody else. So maybe I need to defend like 15% of the time, 12% of the time, something like that. So if I need to defend 12%.
And that would be one of those ones where you wouldn't even randomize. You wouldn't even like have the, excuse me, you wouldn't even have the random number generator or the 100-sided die, let's say, where you rolled it and 15 and lower, you know, you defend, the rest of the time you fold. You wouldn't even randomize in this spot because it would be player specific. It would depend on who's betting. If the initial raiser bets, then cool, you have a 15% defense frequency if it folds back to you. If the old guy over here bets after it's checked to him, it's 100% a fold because this is not a bluffy player. You know what I'm saying? The typical old guy is playing in the old ways, which is showdown value. You know what I'm saying? So it's not one you can randomize even at the small amount of 15% because occasionally you're going to hit that random, call the 15% and just be fucking dead, you know, on the turn. So it's just not a good scenario.
Of the time, pocket tens is probably not in the top 12% of my range, and we can easily fold it. So don't be afraid if you call here and just flop poorly. What happens to a lot of people is they call the pocket tens, they get a somewhat safe flop like Jack XX, and then they won't fold it because hey, tens are good, right? But
and we were talking about in my scenario where it was Jack 4 deuce, nobody had bet. then yes, you most likely have the best hand. When somebody bets, though, fold it away.
No, it turns out 10s are not good against multiple people. We get a good flop here, though. Ask yourself, should we bet or should we check? Well, in multi-way pots, it is somewhat less likely the initial raiser is going to bet, but it's pretty likely someone yet to act after that player will bet if the initial raiser checks. So I'm checking here. I'm not leading. The only time I'm ever betting in these scenarios is when we're in a limped pot, but we're going to discuss limp pots later. Because in limp pots, no one's really likely to have anything, and there is no pre-flop aggressor who feels perhaps a little bit inclined to continuation bet. In multi-way pots, though, there is a pre-flop raiser under the gun, +1. They're supposed to have a good range, right? Lots of overpairs. And these players yet to act could very easily have overpairs or flush draws, etc. So this is definitely a spot to check. I'm not doing any leading, even in multi-way pots. Check, check.
That's exactly what you want.
And right here, we want to ask ourselves, do we have a premium made hand or a draw, or a marginal made hand or junk? Well, this is certainly a premium hand, and that's going to result in me wanting to raise this hand. I don't think we need to go too big. I think something like 5,000 is nice. If we start going too big, our opponent's going to fold out pretty much everything.
This is live poker, so online I think 4,000 speaks to the same bet sizing, but live poker, yeah, I guess I could see it having to be a little bit bigger because of chip denomination. So that makes sense. And the old guy, he bet, you know, it's a third of the pot, but it's still big for a 5-way pot. You're going to see this guy have a lot of sets, and you're just going to be able to get it in right now because he's going to think you're check raising on a flush draw.
You know, if you ran this through Munker Solver, which is a multi-way GTO solver, it may actually say to call here, but I think the play is definitely to raise because notice here big blind can easily have a gut shot or open-ended straight draw or a flush draw, and they're going to fold if I raise, whereas they're always going to call, not really messing up if I call. Also, when you're out of position, you really want to raise immediately because that's going to start building the pot. Whenever you're out of position, you want to do a whole lot of raising compared to calling, just in general, because if you call here, what's going to happen is turn is going to go check, check very often. And then on the river, we bet and the opponent calls, or we bet and the opponent folds, but the pot's medium, right? We want the potential to play a big pot here, so we need to raise. I do go 4,500. This may be a little bit small, but whatever. Opponent calls, turns an ace. We're just going to keep betting, right? Kind of an annoying card because if the opponent did have a hand like pocket jacks, they're going to at least consider folding by the river. If they had pocket nines, they're definitely going to fold.
But there is a wrinkle here where the other player has a set, and we now look like we have a top pair in the flush draw. So again, in that scenario, we're going to get it all in here. So I think your bet should be somewhere around 7,000, maybe 8,000, because that puts 20 in the pot. You're going to get raised, and then it's very easy to get all the money in.
If they have a flush draw, they'll keep calling, but it's not like I'm even happy about that. But I think I want to bet pretty big. We're trying to get it all in by the river in case the opponent has like ace 10, ace.
So maybe the bet on the turn is 10,000. Maybe that's the correct bet because then that puts 33,000 in the pot. We have 34 left. It's kind of easy to get it in.
6, ace 3, ace X of clubs, right? So we do bet pretty big. We bet 11. And in this scenario, notice when we bet big, the aces are never going to fold, like ace X of clubs, right? Or ace X of spades if he has it, like ace jack of spades or something. That's not going to fold. If he has a 10, well, he's probably going to fold, but that's unlikely anyway because I blocked the 10s. If he has a random 6 like 6-5, that's going to fold to any bet as well. So I don't really care about those hands. I'm really just trying to get called by an ace or a better hand. Maybe a hand like pocket jack sticks around again too. And I am trying to give the draws poor odds. And notice this big bet accomplishes that as well. So this is a nice bet. Also it sets up stacks such that I can get in by the river if the opponent does call. Pot goes to 35k, he has 34 left, right? There's another ace. I think we just have an easy all-in. Because at this point, there are some busted draws I could have. Obviously, we could have lots of like 9-8 of clubs, 9-7 of clubs.
This is where you get hero called by the jacks, by the nines, by the, trip aces with a flush draw, like, the ace jack that now has trips. Because the only thing the other player usually sees is, well, he doesn't have an ace here. So they're going to talk themselves into calling quite a lot, and especially an old guy. Believe it or not, you will see old guys show up here with pocket kings. No 3-bet pre-flop. They want to see a safe flop, then get the money in. You also see this at a lot of low levels, like the 10 and 20 and Ls, and once that happens, they don't even care if the ace hit the turn or the river, because why would you bet an ace why would you check raise with an ace in your hand on the flop? And so what? You're saying you have exactly ace 10? No, but I can have other things that beat kings. But these players don't think that way. So I think this is an easy jam. And if he had something like ace 3 of clubs and he beat us, too fucking bad, but that's so rare.
5-4 of clubs, etc. They would love to bluff. And this is a super nut hand. If the opponent has a busted draw, I mean, I don't know what a typical old guy's going to do here, but most of the old guys are just going to not bluff if I check.
Yeah.
So I'm not really looking to induce a bluff. I'm more so looking to bet and get full value from an ace. If I do check, an ace may always bet. But really, if the opponent's sitting here with like ace 2 of clubs, he should probably just let it go check.
Yeah.
Because if he bets here on the river after I've taken this line, if I call him, I probably have a better ace, which I know is not all that likely, but certainly could happen. If the opponent has a hand like jacks, he's probably going to fold to an all-in. So maybe something like a 20k bet could be better, but I think just jamming in this spot is usually going to be ideal. This time we do jam.
Because you look like you're so full of
Probably
shit.
just had a busted flush draw. I will say that if you're playing like live poker and you can just look and tell the opponent's annoyed with the river, like, oh, missed again. You know, if they kind of give off the vibe that they missed on the river, well, now we should not bet. Right?
That's
we
true.
Should check, because we want to do everything we can to potentially induce a bluff. Even from an older guy who's perhaps normally on the tighter side, we want to give that player every possible opportunity to bluff, and by checking, we give them the opportunity to bluff, whereas when we jam, obviously they just have to fold everything. You could also get really tricky and bet something like 1,000, because if you bet 1,000, maybe they'll get annoyed and raise you.
I like that move. One of my first Jedi Mind tricks, I think it was number 3 or 4, was talking about facing this small bet, or putting out that small bet and then getting raised monstrously on the river. And I mean, like, you bet like he said, like 1,000 or 2,000 here just on the end. It looks like you just want a showdown. You would be amazed how many times you will see somebody jam 112 big blinds into you over a 2 big blind bet into a pot that is an easy call off if you have anything good. Like, if we have anything good here, we have less than a pot size bet left. We should be calling off very easily. But goading these players with a small bet, it is really, really amazing to do.
That's not a play I'm making too often. Usually that's a play I'm making against more aggressive, creative players. But if you can tell the opponent has literal nothing, they have literally nothing, right? You can look and tell because they're annoyed that they missed. Then don't bet. Or at least don't bet big, because when you bet big, they're going to fold it.
I think that's also a good scenario, though, if you can tell the player's annoyed. Just sit there and take a lot of time live, like a super long amount of time, and then just betting 2,000 in that 30,000 pot, and then looking at the guy and kind of smiling. Like that, they're going to go, I'm all in. And you go like, oh, well, I have the full house. And it's like they get insulted. And I know this isn't the way to correct, yourself in life, or conduct yourself in life, but at the poker table, especially for guys like me who are very confrontational and very aggressive, it's kind of, you guys can hear Chuchi snoring. It's kind of what I thrive on, is being the jackass. And when you're the jackass who always, and I don't say anything or do anything rude, but when you're the jackass who shows up with the nuts and you're just like so happy with yourself, you'd be amazed how many times people think they can actually like jam you off of an amazingly strong hand just to be because you're a dick. Like, people want to be able to stick it in your face, and when they can do that, let them do it.
Every time. Pocket aces against Darren Elias again. All right.
I am raising big here. I'm probably going to like 13,000 or so on this 50k stack, because I would love to get in 33 blinds pre-flop. Although Jonathan Little's very much more evolved live player than me, especially these bigger buy-in tournaments versus world-class players. So I'm going to see what he says.
All right, so now we're playing shallow stacked, right? 33 big blinds deep against under the gun. 3 betting certainly fine. I have no problem with that. Calling is also nice too. I know that Darren likes to call a lot, and I think he generally thinks I'm not messing around too much pre-flop when I'm 3 betting, even though I am. This is a spot where I think calling is probably ideal. I definitely would like to call with medium pairs in this scenario and stuff like ace-queen and like ace-jack suited. So I definitely want...
Well, also because you're goading a squeeze here. You're goading somebody to 3-bet either on the button or in the blinds. So, and when that's the scenario, it's perfect. And I've done this with like 25 and less blinds, but 33 to me is, especially in tournaments, at this point, everybody's got about 40 blinds. I mean, you're pretty deep in. I mean, you kind of... I don't know if I agree with this. I mean... I don't know what stage of the tournament this is, but I mean, it's only 500 and 1500, so we're talking maybe 8 or 9 levels in a live tournament. So you're probably in the cash, so maybe this is the play. I don't have the experience playing these tournaments at this buy-in level. This is a $5,000 buy-in. So I think this is a good one for me to learn for later.
Want to have a flatting range in this scenario, I think. So I do call. 3-betting's also fine, though. Don't get me wrong. Like, 3-betting's definitely the good standard default. 3-bet to something like 8,500. We get 2 callers, 2 additional callers. And a lot of people look at this and think, oh, no, we got 2 callers. But, no, this is good. This is good. We have the best hand by a mile. Pot's already pretty big, 16K. Only have 45K left. So we're pretty happy. All right. Check to me. All right, how does this board line up with the opponent's ranges? Well, quite often cutoff for the big blind is going to 3-bet queens or jacks. So we're not really worried about them. Darren probably doesn't have a whole lot of queens or jacks because he would also, like pocket queens or pocket jacks, because he'd also bet those 2. This is a spot where I think Darren is good enough to check if he has a hand like ace queen, king queen, ace jack, etc., as he should, because he's out of position in a multi-way pot, in a spot where I could have a lot of queens and jacks, and so could the cutoff, right? So this is a spot where I think we're just happy enough with this hand and we're going to stack off. I suppose there's some world where if I bet and like cutoff calls or raises and then the weak player jams or Darren jams or raises, I'm not going to say I'd fold this, but I would at least consider it. I'd be sick about it, but I think we definitely want to bet here. This is a scenario where... And
I like this bet because it's not too big, not too small. There's 10K in the pot, or there's 16K in the pot. You know, we bet 6K. You know, this is a relatively small bet in relation to the pot, but if somebody looks at our stack and they're like, well, if I call this, there'll be 28,000 in the pot. This guy's got 40 left. He's obviously trying to get the money in. I don't think people look at it that far enough ahead. I've noticed very often, especially playing against players where I'm betting their stack. It happens a lot in cash games where I'm betting to price them out of a draw and they call on the flop, and then I bet this monstrous bet on the turn and they call it even full pot, and in the river they miss and I bet and they've got 10% of their stack left and they cannot call. So it's the kind of thing where I think if players are stack aware, this bet needs to be a little bit bigger, but if they're not, you can just string them in.
If you think about my range to call pre-flop, I outlined it for you just a second ago. It's going to be a lot of good, strong, big cards and big pairs that don't necessarily want to 3-bet against under the gun and get it in. So I think this is a spot where I can realistically bet small with a wide-ish range. Even though the board connects decently well with the opponents, I think this type of board is going to connect very, very well with my pre-flop flatting range. So we can bet more frequently than only the exact best hands, right? That said, this hand's pretty great. I like the bet size. This sets it up such that we can easily bet turn and river and get it all in, and also gives our opponents plenty of room to raise. That said, if you wanted to bet bigger here, like 9K, I think 9K is fine, because if you think about the idea of range connectivity, the opponents yet to act very easily could connect pretty well with this board, so maybe a 9,000 bet's bigger, or it's bigger for sure. Maybe a 9,000 bet's better. We do bet 6, and now the weak player check raises. Ugh. This is not the player I wanted to check raise, because weak players, when they check raise, have something pretty good. All right, so it's our job now to figure out what is pretty good on this flop, and how should we proceed? Well,
my first answer is 2 pair and all the draws. So King 10, 10-9, and Queen Jack. Jack 6, not so much, because weak players won't even play the 6 there. Sets of 6s for sure. Things like that. I think your most common scenario here versus a weak player when they make these big moves is top pair good kicker, like King Queen or Ace Queen. But you're not going to see it with much less than that. So it kind of depends on your very player-specific read. You may just have to end up folding this.
If the opponent has a set or 2 pairs, we're basically dead, right? And when we're basically dead, are we trying to find a fold? And I think the answer, given we're somewhat shallow stacked here and the pot's already kind of big, is just no. Annoying, I know. If you told me the weak player's range was literally only sets and 2 pairs, then yeah, fold. But I very rarely have a read like that when I'm playing live tournaments or online tournaments, because I don't know who these players are. I've maybe played...
Like if this is an old man coffee, you know what I'm saying, where, you know, he's just playing all the, you know, the nut value hands this way and like hates to like get drawn out on, you know what I'm saying, like, you know, a guy in his 50s plus, you know, with a VPIP of somewhere around, you know, 15% or less, and a 3-bet percentage of like 2 or less, you know what I'm saying, you're talking about a scenario where you can easily chuck it away. But without some really definitive read, I think because you're so short, you do have to stack off here. Because if you just call the 9 even, you know what I'm saying, you're still only going to have 31 left. There's now going to be 34 in the pot. It's going in on the turn. Maybe that's the reason you should call. Plus, if he does have a hand like King 10, you've taken away 2 of his outs, you know, because he can't get the ace or the ace on you, you know, so because you're blocking 2 of them, so he only has 6 outs instead of 8. It also depends on the person's temperament at the time, you know, maybe they just took a beat, you don't know. But yeah, I think I got to tell you, the more and more I play over the course of my life, I realize that Stu Unger was right, man. Making big folds is not a great idea because most of the time when you make big folds, you're kind of creating the scenario in your head where you were beaten, where that scenario doesn't really exist. So, you know, this is one where I don't have enough money to fold, and you just get it in.
Played with him for 5 hours, 10 hours at most. And I don't know. I mean, like, I know how Darren Elias plays because I played with him a bunch because we're playing a bunch of the same tournaments together all around the world. But I have no clue how a random weak player in the big blind is playing, right? I mean, I know they're weak. I know they have something decent, but what is that something decent? For all I know, the player could be check raising like Queen 10 or something because they think it's good. So I'm already kind of resigned to the fact I'm going to go broke in this hand. The question then becomes, should I jam or should I call? And I think calling is the right decision by a mile. Because when you jam a weak player in this scenario, they're probably going to start making pretty big folds. If this was a more loose, aggressive, splashy player, who I think has lots of draws and maybe slightly marginal hands like Queen 10, then I would...
It's one of those scenarios where if the money's going to go in anyway, right? Like, if he has, you know, King 10 and you just call here and the turn comes off and it's a blank, doesn't help him or you, he's going to jam. You know what I'm saying? So the money's going to go in regardless of if you get to the turn, it's going in. That being said, raising here, you only serve to kill your action because what weak player, you know, they're not check calling off with the draw. They're not doing all like that. I mean, sometimes they got a bust to catch and they just go for it. But, you know, I think like he said, in this scenario, we're underplaying the aces to induce this action. Like we didn't raise the pre-flop. We just bet small on the flop. We got raised because we look weak. And when you look weak with a strong hand, you should probably just let somebody barrel it off into you, and you know you'll see what happens.
At least consider jamming because they're going to be inclined to call it off. And if with Queen 10, and if they fold a hand like 10-9, I don't care, right? That's fine. But I think against a weak player, I want to do everything I can to make them think whatever, let's call it overvalued hands they have in their range, like a queen or maybe a jack. I want to do everything I can to make them think that those hands are good. And if they do have a queen or a jack, they only have 5 outs, right? Sometimes they have fewer if you know, they have an ace with it. So I think we need to call in this scenario because I'm really not all that susceptible to being outdrawn. I realize they could have 10-9 for a straight draw, right? But even then, that's 8 outs, right? And if the opponent bets the turn, whatever bet size they make is going to basically put them all in. And therefore, I'm not worried about them seeing the... Like, I'm not worried about the idea of giving them great implied odds because I know they only have one bet left, one pot size bet left anyway. So I think I like calling here.
That's probably the best card in the deck right there. Outside of an ace, that's probably the best card. An ace might not even be as good because you're going to see a lot of queen jacks here. You're going to see a lot of jack 10s. Queen jack most commonly because, like I said, the 6 isn't going to be played pre-flop. You know, the jack 6, queen 6 is just not a combo that's going to come up much. So for me, this is a, you know, snap call.
6 and the opponent jams. Take a second, think about this. Is this a good card or a bad card for me? Take a second, I'm going to have some coffee.
I mean, in some scenarios, I guess it could be bad because some players will check raise. But we're talking about a weak player. He's not check raising the suited ace 6, you know, backdoor diamond draw, the suited ace 6 of diamonds, you know, or heart. Well, hearts obviously never. But the jack 6 just doesn't exist here. So I really think this is one where we may have just drawn out. You know, and even then, when we didn't just draw out here and we still have the best hand and they have a hand like King 10 or 10-9, we've taken away more outs. If they have King 10 here, they don't even have 6 anymore. They have 4 outs because if they hit the ace, we make the full house. So, I mean, to me, this is just, you know, it doesn't get any better than this.
This is actually a very good card for me because it was pretty unlikely the opponent was check raising with Queen 6 or Jack 6 unless it was exactly those hands suited. And notice there are relatively few combinations of those. There's fewer combinations of those now. Also, if the opponent had pocket 6s, there's only one combination of that now. And if the opponent had Queen Jack, I now have the best hand, right? So this is actually a really good card for me. Maybe the best card in the deck, really. Normally you're not thinking the bottom card pairing is the best card in the deck for you, but if you think about a reasonable weak player strategy, this probably is really the best card in the deck for me. You may say, isn't an ace good? Well, an ace completes King 10, which some weak players will raise, right? So sometimes when the ace comes, I'm behind. An ace and a 6 are definitely the best cards, though, for sure. Anyway, opponent jams. This is an easy call at this point. Am I good? What, 20, 28% of the time, something like that? Definitely. I mean, I would be actually kind of surprised if I'm beat here. Notice again, a lot of players in the big blind 3-bet queens and jacks pre-flop, which are the main hands I lose to. So I really lose to almost nothing at this point, right? So when the opponent does jam here, I expect to be against queens, jacks, queen, jack, jack 6 every once in a while, but I think we're mostly going to be against either random draws or like ace, queen, king, queen, queen, jack, queen 10 type hands. You may say, would a weak player ever raise with a draw? Again, I don't know. I don't know how this random weak player plays. Some weak player raise with draws, some people don't. So anyway, easy call here. Trivially easy call, by the way. Like it's a no-brainer call. If the turn was a king, I think it's actually a fold. If the turn was a 10, I think it's also probably a fold. If the turn's a 9, it starts to get a little bit closer to a call, I think. If the turn's an 8, I think it's also a call. 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2 is a call. That's usually how I'm thinking about that. So notice I'm trying to figure out like which cards are particularly bad for my range and good for my opponent's range. And then I'm going to call off accordingly. We'll discuss which turn cards and river cards are better for your opponent's range and your range coming up in the turn and river sections later. So anyway, opponent did have the king-queen, drastically overvalued it, and we win all the money. To be fair, what should the opponent have done with king-queen here? Let's put yourself in their shoes with king-queen. All right, if I was in the opponent's shoes, what would I do? Pre-flop, would I call?
I mean, you're probably squeezing pre-flop, right? If you're not going to squeeze pre-flop, then you really can't take much aggressive action in this hand throughout. You probably just have to check call down, you know.
Call. Raise call. I'll tell you all a play that I found to be very profitable. I have a lot of data to back this up. Whenever you're against early to middle position raisers and a few callers, this is actually a really good spot to 3-bet as a bluff with big cards. Now, king-queen flops pretty well, so perhaps you don't want to 3-bet exactly king-queen, but king-jack, king-10. I
think this is one of those ones where if it was suited, I would just call it, but offsuit with the king-queen, I'm going to 3-bet because, like he said, we have blockers to hands like kings and queens, ace-king, ace-queen, things like that, and, you know, this can be pocket 10s. This can be, an ace-10 or an ace-jack or something like that, where now when we put the heat on, from the big blind, like we could have just called here from the big blind, right, and seen the flop, but you're making the statement of, no, I actually like my hand enough that I want to play a bigger pot. So raising here, you don't even have to go that big. Like you can actually go to like 12,000 here, maybe even less. Probably 12 to 15,000 somewhere is proper. Like you don't want to get too tricky. But yeah, I like 12,000 here because the under the gun player who, is a competent player, he could be opening 10-9. And then, he knows he's out of position to these players, and his even pocket 10s, he's going to be like, well, I don't know what these guys are doing. I don't know what I'm up against here. He's going to be out of position. He's just going to, cut his losses. And then the guy who called next, it's like, this should never be aces because of all this action behind. Standard, you're worried about really one hand that's going to rejam on you. And when it rejams, you're just going to go ahead and, fold. So without a rejam behind, I think you're just going to see a lot of folds here in that scenario because you've reopened the betting and now this player doesn't know if he calls the 12,000. Does this guy jam? Does this guy jam? Same scenario for if this guy folds and this guy calls. Does this guy jam? What happens now? You know what I'm saying? So it kind of really puts a lot of factors out there. And I've seen players fold hands as strong as pocket queens here, in this scenario because they're just so fucked out of position. And having 40 blinds left is fine. Like, just, okay, better spots will come later. It's not like the guy has 20 blinds and he's like, you know what, queens are good enough.
And queen jack, hands like that. These hands very often would prefer to play as a 3-bet in the big blind. Don't want to go too much into data and stats here, but basically when you flat call those hands, you basically break even in the big blind, which is good. It's a fine result. Because normally you lose a big blind when you just fold, right? But if you call here, you're basically going to break even in your big blind, which is a solid result. But when you 3-bet, you often end up winning a big blind or 1.5 big blinds, which is very, very nice. So I would not hate a 3-bet to something like 13,000 in this scenario. I think it'd actually be pretty sweet. And then if you get 4-bet by me, then you fold, right? That said, if Calling's fine too. I would check the flop. This player bets. I would definitely just check call the king queen. Turn would come. This player would check. Notice here, if this player checks this turn, now if you think about their range, assuming they check call.
Yeah, there's a lot more sixes now in their range when they check call instead of check raising. So the aces might decide to pot control here and just check behind, and then, you know, you can show down the king queen when they make a reasonable value bet on the river. You know what I'm saying? So like, and you induce bluffs. So I that's one real big argument for just calling. Like, you know,
call my flop bet. Now the 6 actually hits their turn their flop check calling range really well, right? Because they would check call a lot of 6s. So this is a spot where I should actually now proceed very cautiously. So if the opponent did check call in this scenario, they would certainly not have gotten stacked, right? They would have ended up checking the turn. They'd probably value bet the river. I would just call, or they would check the river and then I would value bet, and then they would call and they would lose half their stack instead of all their stack. So you see here, this player in a $5,000 buy-in tournament has all of a sudden just punted off. I don't know how many starting stacks this is, but half a starting stack or something like that, because they did not understand how to play post-flop well. And by learning how to play post-flop multi-way well, you're going to end up crushing your opponents. So make sure you are very cautious in scenarios where you realistically could be beat. And right here, like king queen is a good hand, but it certainly could be beat, right? Like I could have lots of pocket queens, jacks, 6s. Also queen jack, very much so. Ace queen, very much so. And every once in a while, slow played aces, right? So I'm going to say this was a horrible play by the opponent. Very rarely am I just going to say the opponent played horribly, but this was a horrible play by the opponent, and I was there to capitalize because we studied these scenarios and we would not have made the same mistake the opponent makes. So yeah, heads up. Well, multi-way is very different than heads up, especially when you're against a lot of players. You have to be way more cautious. Don't think that you should be continuation betting frequently or applying a lot of aggression trying to push people around, because someone is likely to have a good hand. And if it's not you, it's probably somebody else.
Except for those very specific scenarios where we talk about where you can go for bluffs on very scary boards for everybody. Being out of position, small blind, something like that. Let's do the quiz. Which is true of multi-way pots? Select all that apply. Minimum defense frequency is increased. Well, that's not true. It's decreased. The pre-flop raiser should always check. That's not true either. The range advantage can lead to spots where you bet your entire range. None of these are true. All these things are incorrect. I love the percentages that they show. That's the percentage of people that answered the other way. Which of these should make you check more often, select all that apply? Being out of position, yeah. Lots of players in the pot, yeah. Board is coordinated, yeah. All of them, yeah, exactly. Let's see here. On an uncoordinated board, hand values are similar to heads-up pots. This is true, similar, but there is a qualifier here. Versus the blinds, it's very different. But uncoordinated boards, ace, king, deuce, ace, 7, deuce, things like that. You know, as the original pre-flop raiser, you're going to be able to c-bet these more often and just take them down. But when the blinds are involved, you know, they can have ace 7, you know, they can have, you know, pocket deuces, pocket 7s, things like that. Yeah, so we'll mark this as complete. I believe this section was just this one long 30-minute section, which was very dense and I think very well done, honestly. So as soon as this loads, here we go. Okay, this is the next section, playing in limp pots. Let's go back to the course. Limp pots, not very common in tournaments, far more common in the early stages of tournaments and in cash games because you're going to have way more blinds, so people will just flop around. But let's go back to the course and see where we're at. Come on. This is they've been working on the internet locally, so this is a little slow right now. Come on. All right, so we're on flop strategies. We've made it all the way through this to playing multi-way. So the next section is playing limped pots and then playing 3-bet pots where somebody raises and somebody else re-raises. Yeah, so yeah, that's where we're at today. Going for about an hour and a half. I think that's enough study for today. Definitely more amped up to play. It's going to be cash games. I'm still not quite in tournament mode yet. I think I will be tomorrow and Sunday. But we're just going to play a shitload of cash today and go for a long stream or several shorter streams. Trying to play 6 to 8 hours today. So we'll see. But this entire video will be posted on YouTube within the hour, and it'll have a a new thumbnail. But yeah, so I think it was a good study session. I appreciate everybody coming out. Big shout outs to Uncle Bruiser. Everybody get out there and follow him, because I want him to have some followers, even though he doesn't stream on Twitch yet. He was talking about doing it. And yeah, I think he's a great, very entertaining guy. So I'll see you guys later. I'll probably be back in about an hour or so. I'm just going to shower and eat and then get right back on it. So see you in a little bit.